Good morning. My name is Ramya Rasuk. I'm the Associate Director for Research here at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. And on behalf of the center and my colleagues, I want to welcome you to this special Crown seminar. Today, we're very excited to host two incredible scholars, both based on the West Coast and scholars of comparative politics and gender who focus on the Middle East and North Africa. First, let me introduce our speaker, Carolyn Barnett. She's an assistant professor in the School of Government and Public Policy and the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. In addition, she's been a Crown Center non-resident fellow since 2022, I believe. And just to give a quick shout, last year she wrote a wonderful Middle East brief for us, Shutout of Good Jobs, Contemporary Obstacles to Women's Employment in MENA, which addresses the question of why do relatively few women work in the Middle East and North Africa? And as all her work, she's debunking some of our conceptual or conventional assumptions about that and looking at the ways in which women's resistance to women's employment outside of the household is something that has to be reconsidered in light of her wonderful research, which has appeared in addition in the Journal of Politics, the American Journal of Political Science Research and Methods, Comparative Political Studies, Politics and Gender, and PS, Political Science and Politics. Today, she will be talking to us about underestimating men, pessimism about support for gender equality in Morocco and beyond. And we're very happy that she will be in conversation with Lindsay Benstead, who is Professor of Politics and Global Studies in the Mark O. Hatfield School of Government and the Director of the Middle East Studies Center at Portland State University. Previously, she served as a fellow in the Middle East Program and the Women's Global Leadership Initiative at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And previously, she was a Kuwait visiting professor at Sciences Po in Paris. She holds a PhD in public policy and political science from the University of Michigan and served as a doctoral fellow at Yale University and a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University as well. She's conducted extensive research across North Africa and MENA, particularly in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And her research on women in politics, public opinion, and survey methods has appeared in Perspectives on Politics, the International Journal of Public Opinion Research, Governance, Public Affairs, and many, many other journals. Lindsay, thank you so much for being with us today. So a quick reminder that this seminar is being recorded and will be posted on the Crown Center website shortly after concluding today's talk. As usual, our format will be as follows. Dr. Barnett will start us off with a quick kind of 10-minute overview of her topic. And this will be followed by a conversation between Lindsay and Carolyn that will last for about 30 minutes. And then at about 11:45, we'll switch over to questions and answer from our audience. So please, at any time during their conversation, feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I believe that's it. So Carolyn, please take it away.
Thank you, Ramir. Right. Thank you all so much for being here today and for having me. So what I'm going to do today briefly is give you an overview of some of the main arguments of a book that I'm working on, which argues that people have a tendency to underestimate men's support for gender equality, and that we should care about this, that this matters for not only how policies are implemented, but potentially how further advocacy for women's rights should occur. So just to kind of frame thinking about this in the context of Morocco, which is where most of the work in the book focuses, a few years ago, if you've been paying attention to Morocco at all, you'll know about this. The king launched a new reform process to update the country's family code, known as the Mudawana. And this is a big deal because if you go back to the early 2000s, the prior reform of the Mudawana was one of the kind of signature achievements of King Mohammed VI in his early on after he came to power. Pushing this forward was seen as a real signal of his commitment to women's rights, and was really lauded internationally as being, a major step forward for women in Morocco. So this new process, in launching this, he acknowledged there's been tremendous progress, but also that there are some, outstanding issues that need to be addressed. And this has really been welcomed by women's rights advocates in Morocco. At the same time, as within the 2000s, there's been certainly some vocal opposition to this process, not only the fact that it is occurring, but the specific content of some of the reforms. So shown here is Abdelaziz Ben Kiran of the PJD in Morocco, former prime minister, who has been very vocal throughout the past couple of years in criticizing potential proposed reforms to the Mudawana as threatening to undermine, society as a whole, and in particular recently calling for that some of the proposals might weaken masculinity in Morocco. So he's been, very vocal in kind of articulating the backlash to these proposed reforms, which the reforms themselves are beyond the scope of this presentation, but we can certainly bring that up more in the Q&A if you're interested in. But what I want to suggest in this talk is that while such backlash and criticisms are certainly important and receive a lot of attention, I think sometimes not only we as scholars, but the public in general gives disproportionate weight to these kinds of remarks and this kind of backlash in thinking about where public opinion lies on issues related to women's rights and gender equality. So my thinking about this was prompted in part by some conversations I had when I was doing fieldwork in Morocco a few years ago, which are kind of summed up in this quotation from a woman who used to be a politician. She's now moved on to other things. But she told me that, when she was in her role as a politician, she said the most improbable people would come up to me, old men, poor men, and would thank her for work that she was doing to advance women's rights. And her argument was there was this silent majority of men who are actually in favor of all of this, but that they don't feel like they can talk about it because they don't perceive that other people also hold the same opinions. So there was this, she was arguing to me that there was this kind of repression of true attitudes on gender equality. So that got me really interested, especially as I was simultaneously hearing a lot of narratives of deep pessimism, skepticism about the prospect for women's rights to continue advancing in Morocco in light of, weak implementation of the prior Mudawana and resistance to further reform. So there's these sort of competing narratives that I was encountering. And I think it's worth noting here that, in fact, while maybe a silent majority is a bit of an overstatement on certain issues, we do see in our public opinion data that men's attitudes in Morocco on various issues have become more gender egalitarian over time. So what I'm showing in these graphs are average responses or the proportion of respondents holding what I would term the more egalitarian position on a few different issues over time. And this is aggregating data from the Arab Barometer, the Afro Barometer, and the World Values Survey, so major nationally representative public opinion surveys. And what they show, so the red lines on these graphs are Moroccan men over time, and the other gray lines in the back are other countries in the MENA region for comparison. So what you can see is on some issues here, like can women be the prime minister or president? In other cases, do men make better executives? Do men make better political leaders? Is divorce justifiable? We see this kind of trend over time towards holding more egalitarian attitudes. It's not always a majority and it's not always linear, but one could certainly look at these and have a kind of glass half empty perspective. But given what we as social scientists know about how hard it is to change attitudes, I actually think some of these trends are pretty remarkable. So, certainly there are still conservative attitudes. I'm not saying there aren't. And certainly men in all of this data do continue to hold more sort of gender inegalitarian attitudes than women do. I use the term conservative as kind of a shorthand for that. But what I show in my work is that underestimating the extent to which men do support greater gender equality is pretty common, especially by men although not exclusively, and particularly about men. So people underestimate women's support too sometimes, and women also underestimate support, but this is a particular phenomenon by men and about men. So in the interest of time, I've run multiple surveys in Morocco at this point where I look at a bunch of different issues and try to measure not only what people actually believe, and benchmark that against other surveys that have been conducted, but also look at what people think other people believe. So asking them questions like, do you think that your neighbors would agree with this issue? Or do you think that Moroccans as a whole would agree, or what proportion of Moroccans do you think would agree? And then sometimes asking separately about what they think men or women believe. In the interest of time today, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples, but I'm happy to talk about what this looks like across other issues more in the Q&A. So when we look at women's political representation, so one of the questions I asked on a couple surveys was a statement, there should be more women in positions of political authority. And I find so this is showing actual attitudes in two surveys. So a telephone survey and an online survey. The middle shows all respondents, and then I've broken it out into men and women separately. So you see in the red and orange bars, there is a gender gap. Women are more supportive of this than men, which is consistent with what other surveys find. And these relatively high levels of support are also consistent with other surveys showing that Moroccans are pretty supportive of the gender quotas that exist for women's political representation. So even though there might be people who say, well, on balance, men are better political leaders, that doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't wish to see more women in political office as well, right? There's a sort of nuance to these attitudes. But what I find that's notable is that when I ask them, well, would your neighbors also agree? Or would most Moroccans also agree, which are these kind of darker brown lines? People are really skeptical of that, right? So we see sometimes quite large gaps in their impression of the extent to which other people would agree that there should be more women in political authority. On another survey, this was a face-to-face nationally representative survey. Some co-authors and I, this was done with Alex Blackman and Marwa Shalaby, went back to that question, men make better political leaders. And the graph here is showing the percent agreement with this. So in this graph, a higher bar represents a sort of more inegalitarian attitude. And what we find is that, it's about half, right? That's consistent again with what other surveys have found, would agree with this item. People perceive that there's more agreement with this. And when we break it down into what men and women believe, we find that basically men are totally discounting what women believe when they estimate the percentage of Moroccans who would agree that men make better leaders. They're basically looking at what other men believe and anchoring on that, whereas women are also anchoring on what men believe. So there's, on the one hand, this tendency to underestimate how much other people would agree there should be more women in authority. And then when people think about what everyone believes, they also have a tendency to focus on men's, more patriarchal attitudes. In a separate experiment that was on that survey, we used a conjoint experiment, which, again, we can talk more about in the Q&A if people are curious, to look at people's attitudes towards political candidates of different genders. And one of the things we found is that male respondents overall didn't demonstrate a clear preference for male candidates, which is something that other experiments have recently been finding. But all respondents believed that men would prefer male candidates. And men especially tended to believe this. So again, we see this mismatch between sort of people's underlying preferences and their beliefs about what other people would support. So, okay, so maybe in politics, there's some greater support for women's representation and people don't really believe that support is there yet. But what about within the household? Right here, we might think that gender norms are a little bit more entrenched. So I have this question, again, appearing on those first two surveys that I talked about, one via telephone, one online, asking people if they agree that men bear equal responsibility for taking care of children and other household tasks. Now, I was personally surprised at the high level of agreement with this item, and it might have something to do with the wording, which we can discuss. But basically, in both surveys, I find pretty high agreement with this among both genders. But much less perception, again, in these kind of brown bars, of agreement either among one's neighbors or among Moroccans as a whole, and particularly among Moroccans as a whole. On another survey, I had two items that kind of came at this from different angles. So one said that men should contribute to daily household tasks, including things like childcare and cleaning. And another question asked, is it not manly to contribute to these tasks? So kind of from a more negative valence. And this graph kind of inverts the coding on the second one. So you're seeing how many would agree with the more egalitarian view. So how many would disagree that it's not manly to contribute. So again, we find pretty high, positioning on the more egalitarian side of things among both women and men. And here specifically, I'm showing my respondents' perceptions of what men believe. So in this survey, I did ask separately, what do women believe and what do men believe? And I find that, everyone is skeptical that men would support these things. And women are especially skeptical. And I think this probably has to do with them observing continued serious inequality in household contributions. But so there's some gender differentiation here, but the key takeaway is that everyone is really skeptical that men actually, even in the abstract, value more equal household contributions. So one of the things that was really interesting to me working on this is I came at this starting in Morocco, building off this sense from some of my interlocutors that was kind of hidden support that people didn't really appreciate or that people overestimated others' opposition. Well, it turns out that this isn't unique to Morocco. This is actually something of a global phenomenon. And so I'm fortunate that some other scholars working on similar issues have undertaken the very expensive task of running a lot of surveys around the world. So they ran concurrent surveys in 60 countries, asking people both about their attitudes on some gender norms, as well as their perceptions of both men's support and women's support for those same positions. So this is their data. And what I'm showing here on the left is the percentage of men who agree that women have the right to work outside the home, without restriction. Oops, sorry. And on the right is perceptions of men's agreement. So what percentage of men do you believe support women's right to work outside the home? And I've just put log GDP on the x-axis here so you can get a sense of how this varies a little bit across like levels of economic development. But what's noteworthy here is that everywhere people are underestimating men's agreement with this item. And Morocco turns out to be kind of average in the extent of this misperception. So again, I'm not saying there are no patriarchal attitudes in Morocco, right? Only about 75% of men in their sample agreed. But Moroccans only thought that about 50% of men agreed. So there's a kind of massive misperception there. If it's actually 3 and 4 and you only think it's 1 and 2, I think that's pretty substantial. But again, what's noteworthy to me is that this isn't only Morocco. So what is going on here? Why do people have such a tendency to underestimate men's support for gender equality? So in my book project, one of the things I do is go through kind of a long list of potential explanations for why this might happen some places more than others, right? So it's sort of a universal phenomenon, but there is variation in the extent to which people underestimate. So I show that we can't simply attribute this to a bunch of things, including how much time has passed, how much attitudes have changed, how much people are in the labor force or represented in politics, how active and autonomous women's movements are, or even things like the strength of authoritarianism and its link to patriarchy, or the influence of religion per se, by which I mean sort of religiosity at the individual level, or the institutionalization of religion. Instead, I have an argument that links the extent of these misperceptions to women's rights reforms themselves. So going back to that Mudawana reform process, this argument was kind of inspired by thinking about what happened in Morocco and how people talk about it. So my argument is that many people around the world perceive women's rights as being kind of imposed in top-down fashion, either because undemocratic leaders are advancing women's rights, which has happened in a lot of places around the world in the last few decades, or because they see it as kind of a diffusion of an international norm, which scholars have also documented, and that this perception of it as being kind of an outside influence can sustain itself, even where grassroots activism has often been very critical. So what this does is it undermines the potential of law and legal reform to signal that attitudes are changing. At the same time, and thinking back to our example of Ben Kiran and his many kind of inflammatory statements about the Mudawana reform, whenever there is progress, whenever there is reform, we see very visible opposition being mobilized, particularly in places that have more civic space for that opposition to express itself. And in some cases as well, the reform process also actually reinforces the salience of authoritative religious institutions. And we can think of that very clearly in the Moroccan case, because the Mudawana reforms, both the past one and the current one, are being done in close consultation with religious scholars who need to kind of sign off on the legitimacy of proposals vis-a-vis Islamic law. But it's also salient in like Latin American cases, where the Catholic Church has often played a very important institutional role in the state, and has been very vocal during reform processes. So I argue there's this kind of institutional explanation vis-a-vis the way women's rights reforms often happen and what people observe about that. And then I argue that in the midst of this, men are especially likely to become trapped in a kind of spiral of silence, to use a term from social psychology, where, again, kind of as my female politician interlocutor pointed out, men don't think other people support this, so they're not as willing to speak out. So then people don't think men support this, so then they're not willing to speak out, and it kind of creates a vicious cycle. So just to wrap up, why should we care about this? I think, maybe it's just kind of an interesting empirical fact that people underestimate men's support for gender equality, but it doesn't really matter. Well, I think it does matter for several reasons. These are not exhaustive. There might be other reasons it matters. The first is that when people perceive society to be less supportive of gender equality than it is, that might lead them to kind of pull their punches, both potentially as researchers in terms of what they think it's okay to investigate, but also potentially as bureaucrats in terms of what they think is possible to enforce. Another reason, going back to that spiral of silence, is that men might be hesitant to act publicly in line with things they really believe, because they're nervous that they'll be ostracized or seen as deviant, because they think that other people aren't as supportive. And the last reason is that, one of the things I've seen in Morocco, as well as other cases recently, is that there's a big focus on trying to change attitudes, right? So there's a lot of this narrative that, okay, we've done the legal change, but now we really need to change mentalities. You'll hear this all the time in Morocco. We have to change the mentalities. And again, I'm not necessarily arguing that that's not the case, but I think it ignores a kind of lower hanging fruit, which is making sure people are aware of the mentalities that have already changed, and making them aware of that so that it might inform the way that they act. So I will stop there, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Lindsay and to your questions as well.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. This is so interesting, and it's such a delight to be able to discuss it with you. You provide evidence that is also supported by other research, which suggests that social attitudes are changing, and that men in particular are becoming more egalitarian in their viewpoints. I'm just wondering if you have a sense as to why that might be happening, and whether you think it's just happening in Morocco, the region, or globally.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, I mean, I think, there's a lot of different theories about why attitudes change, and I'm not going to claim to have the answer. I do think in Morocco, it's probably a confluence of the legal change that has occurred, which shifted sort of benchmarks for what is acceptable, and what kind of incentives people have to behave in different ways. I think it's also been driven in large part by educational increases, right? So we do see, I sort of showed the overall trends, but we do see particularly among more educated men, more gender egalitarian attitudes. So there is still an education gap, which suggests to me that education is playing an important role here. Interestingly, it's not a generational thing. So, apart from maybe perhaps younger men being more educated, if you just look at the kind of age bracket breakdowns, younger people are not necessarily more egalitarian than older people, which is a little bit funny when we think of, because a lot of research suggests that generational change is how these things usually adjust, which suggests that these sort of legal reforms and broader narratives of the importance of women's rights, the importance of women's role in development that have been propagated, by the Moroccan state as well as by women's rights activists, that actually is having an impact. As well as I think just broader global norm change kind of diffusing into Morocco. I do think it's quite interesting that if you look back at those charts, does seem to be more change in Morocco than other countries in the Middle East and North Africa. And that's where I think the legal context and the kind of narrative in Morocco that it's, advancing women's rights, I think that probably has had some impact, but it's impossible to pinpoint, precisely. I think it's also important to note, I show these trends. There is also reason to be concerned, right? So in some of the most recent data, especially in the wake of COVID, there was some evidence of a sort of resurgence of some more patriarchal attitudes. And personally, I think that's linked to a lot of the social dynamics during lockdowns and afterwards that emerged, and a sort of sense of wanting to retrench, men's roles as providers in the face of really tough economic situations. But if you look on this kind of long durée, there is this trend towards more egalitarian attitudes that I think we can chalk that up to probably a mix of global norms, legal institutional change, and education.
That's really interesting. And, you show multiple sets of evidence that men are becoming more egalitarian in their viewpoints. I think a conventional view or a conventional reading of that data might be that, well, this is social desirability. There's an international women's rights norm that's diffusing. There are all kinds of programs in Morocco, advocating for gender equality. And so one argument might be that respondents are just responding in a socially desirable fashion. But I think what is refreshing about your argument is that you're suggesting that maybe respondents are actually disclosing their true preferences. What would you say about the argument that perhaps increases in egalitarian attitudes among men really just is an indicator of social desirability bias in surveys?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to fully get at this, and you as a survey researcher yourself, I'm sure know that there's different techniques we can take to try to, see if people are being honest on surveys. One question I get a lot about this project is, how do you know that when people say what they think other people think, that's just not them telling you what they really think themselves? And, I think that doesn't explain these findings for a few reasons. So one is that, actually some meta-analysis that people have done recently suggests that, people lying or misrepresenting themselves in surveys is not actually as widespread a behavior as we think, even on fairly sensitive issues, that people just don't feel that much of a need most of the time to misrepresent themselves, right? They're not really that worried about what researchers think of them. They might be worried what people in their family think of them, right? Or in their communities. But they're not necessarily afraid that they're going to be looked down on, by surveyors. And that, to the extent we can estimate this bias using some of these more sophisticated techniques, it's typically very small. Another reason I think that we can trust that this represents a true trend, is that it reflects social change that you can see on the ground as well, right? So, on the one hand, there's these kind of pessimistic narratives. On the other hand, one of the arguments actually that's been made in favor of this new Mudawana reform is the law is out of step with how people actually live their lives. The way marriages work, the way relationships work has clearly changed. Everyone can see that. And so the law is no longer in line with social realities, and that misalignment is creating problems. So to the extent that we can sort of see in people's their revealed preferences in their behavior, there's a lot to suggest that these are really true attitudes that we're seeing. In analysis of my own surveys, I do a bunch of different kind of robustness checks to try to see, like, do I think that people are really being honest here? One of the things that I do, building off of some of your own work, is looking at whether being interviewed by a man or a woman makes a difference. And I do find, very minor differences in how people report their own attitudes depending on if they're responding to a man or a woman. But interestingly, I find the most difference there on the attitudes where people tend to admit holding pretty conservative beliefs, right? So basically, where attitudes are more egalitarian, there's very little difference in what people say to male and female enumerators. But when it is an issue where attitudes are still more patriarchal, one might say. So for example, there's this question of, when jobs are scarce, do men have more right to a job? And a lot of surveys, including my own, have found that Moroccans still agree with that to a pretty high degree, somewhere in the range of 70 to 80%. So, first of all, if there's such social desirability bias, why are so many of them admitting that they agree with that statement? Which, if you think there's an international norm pressure towards supporting equality in the labor force, they should be less willing to admit that, I would think. But second of all, on that question in particular, they're more likely to admit an egalitarian attitude to a female enumerator in a context where they clearly know that that's not the majority view. So that suggests to me that, to the extent there is social desirability bias on some of these issues, we don't actually know which way it's going. I think sometimes it might be that people feel pressure to seem more egalitarian, but I think there's probably also cases where people, again, perceive that there's this dominant conservative norm and they feel like they can't deviate from that. And maybe the context of a one-on-one interview with the female enumerator, they feel comfortable actually admitting that, no, like, I don't agree that men should have more right? That actually there should be, a more egalitarian norm here. So I think we need to do more work on this. I want to do more work on this and trying to pinpoint exactly how these things are happening. But broadly, I feel confident that, to the extent people might misrepresent their views, that can't account for these really broad trends. And I don't think it can account for the misperceptions that I'm showing either.
Yes, thank you. Now, Morocco is a relatively liberal country in the region. I'm wondering if you expect to find or have found similar trends in more conservative countries, such as the Gulf countries. Do you think we underestimate the extent to which men support gender equality in countries like Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Unfortunately, I have to be totally speculative here because, to my knowledge, no one's done this kind of study in those countries. Even the cross-national data that I showed you all from the Benstead et al. Comparative surveys, they didn't do any Gulf countries. They did do some other countries in the MENA region. So Jordan, Egypt, Algeria, Iraq, and Iran, I think, were in there. But none of the Gulf countries. That's a really interesting question. I think, yeah, I honestly don't know what to expect, but I think given the broad tendency toward underestimating equality that we can see globally, I would expect to find some there. I think I would maybe expect to find a bit less misperception than in a place like Morocco, which does have this kind of more liberal atmosphere. However, one of the other sources of inspiration for my project was a study done in Saudi Arabia, showing that, it was working with not nationally, but with a subset of men who found they tended to underestimate other men's openness to their wives working. And they did an intervention that found that when you correct that misperception, those men then become more willing for their wife to have a job. I'm a little skeptical that simple informational interventions like that are going to have an impact at scale. I think we need a lot more research on when does providing that information make an impact on people. But it does suggest that, at least in Saudi Arabia, at least on that issue, there is also this kind of misperception taking place.
Interesting. Now, in your work, you've suggested that authoritarian governance tends to foster misperceived norms differently or to a greater extent than in a democracy. Could you unpack a little bit more and explain how authoritarian governance or authoritarian regimes tend to support misconceived norms?
Yeah. So one of the things so I developed this argument again before seeing this cross-national data. And so I've since, I published an article in Comparative Political Studies basically arguing that authoritarian regimes in general are prone to fostering, misperceptions of public attitudes simply because the information environment is poor, right? People don't necessarily feel free to express what they believe in general. And then when laws are passed, people know that that's not reflecting some kind of democratic majority preference, right? Maybe it does, but they have no way of connecting those two things necessarily. So that this idea that law is a reflection of public preferences is broken, and so law can't have this expressive function that scholars talk about it having in democratic settings. So drawing on that kind of informational argument, I argue that we're likely to see more misperceptions in authoritarian regimes. I've kind of nuanced that argument a little bit now that I've seen this like variation around the world. I think because what I actually find is that in the most authoritarian countries, misperceptions are a little smaller than in these kind of middling cases, right? So places like Morocco, where there is some genuine political competition, but maybe not full democracy as political scientists would describe it. Because then you kind of get a mix of these two dynamics that I pointed to. So one is the kind of lack of law's ability to be expressive, right? People discount it as reflecting society's preferences because they know that that's not how policy is really being made. But on the other hand, the greater sort of space for activism and civil liberties means that you get these highly contentious processes, right? It's not just, the Chinese government says it's going to be so, and so it is, and no one's protesting, right? Instead, you get the dynamic of the king launching a new reform process and Ben Kiran constantly being in the news, dumping on it, right? So you get this more open space for contestation, which I think can contribute to this sort of overweighting of the vocal minority that's really opposed. So what I end up arguing is that it's kind of in this sort of hybrid regime space or weak democracy or competitive autocracy, that in kind of in that range where we should see the most misperceptions. And that's actually what I find in the data. I find that the data are consistent with that argument.
Really interesting how you highlight the comments by Ben Karin and the Party of Justice and Development. Do you think that religion in public life plays a role in fostering misperceived norms?
So I think it's kind of one has to make kind of a nuanced argument here. When I look, for example, in the survey data, at the individual level, religiosity has no correlation with the extent to which people misperceive norms, right? So it's not like the most religious people are the ones who have the biggest misperceptions. I don't find evidence of that. What I do think is true, kind of going back to the argument I alluded to at the end of the presentation, is that the importance of religion in public life can be more or less salient. And to the extent that religious institutions oppose advances in women's rights or specific steps toward gender equality, that opposition can become more salient as women's rights advance and as attitudes become more egalitarian. So I think it plays a role in generally being a touchstone that people look at as, well, we live in a very conservative society. The role of religion is so important, in terms of framing their narrative about society as a whole, but not so much at the individual level.
It's really interesting. What do you think it is about the politics of how women's rights norms have expanded? What do you think it is about how these politics unfold in the global South that may be contributing to misperceived gender norms?
Yeah, so I think part of it is, I think that we've seen a diffusion of gender equality policies, and they're kind of, if you pay attention to like what, the international development sphere, gender mainstreaming has become very important in basically everything. Gender disaggregated data, making sure that everything is gender sensitive, right? There's this kind of, pervasive attention to gender in the international sphere, alongside, at least until recently, a kind of pressure from Western countries for countries in the global South to address weaknesses in women's rights. It'll be interesting to see going forward how that evolves. And I think, what I document in my qualitative work, especially, is that in Morocco, even though we know that the women's rights movement in Morocco has been so important to getting things on the agenda, to pushing the regime to do the Mudawwana reform and a lot of other things like the gender quotas, like violence against women laws, and so on. Even though we know how important that is, that's not necessarily the public narrative about why women's rights in Morocco have advanced, unfortunately. And the narrative is much more that, oh, well, the king wanted to do this, or, oh, well, it's just about our international relationships, right? France is pushing us, the US is pushing us, so of course we're doing this, or that it's a kind of inevitable part of being in the modern world, and Morocco has to go along to get along. And so there's this perception that this whole process is very divorced from society. And I think that's, again, that's not a dynamic that's unique to Morocco. If you go to other countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, maybe parts of South Asia, there's a sense that, yeah, there's some domestic support for this, but this is really, kind of part of neocolonialism. This is part of, our dependent position in the global in global geopolitics, and that we just sort of have to accept it. And that, I think, leads people to discount how much domestic support there really is.
Very interesting. I know in the the first round of changes to the Mudawwana, there was an attempt to reform the Mudawwana and to consider it a reinterpretation of Sharia law. What are some of the new proposals to reform the Mudawwana, and why are they controversial?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different things. I'm not going to go through all of them. That would really be another presentation. But I think a couple that are especially noteworthy are some proposed changes to the rights that women have in the event of divorce. So in particular, women who maintain custody of their children after divorce will now also be the legal guardians of those children. That's this is all still in proposal phase, right? None of this is actually passed yet, but the idea is women who have custody would also have legal guardianship, which would circumvent their need to kind of, go to their ex-husbands to get paperwork done if they want to switch schools or whatever for their kids. Another that's very controversial, and that was specifically the one Ben Kiran was responding to when he talked about weakening masculinity, was this idea that women's non-financial contributions to the household during marriage should be considered when determining kind of division of assets and alimony payments in the event of divorce, right? So the idea being that, women sacrifice the ability to earn money in the labor market when they stay home to raise children and take care of the home, and that those contributions should be taken into account. So that's one of them. I think, there's also some proposals related to reforming inheritance rules. That's been maybe the most sensitive vis-a-vis, the content of Islamic law and sort of how Sharia is being interpreted. And my understanding is that there were some initial proposals related to inheritance that the sort of religious scholars rejected and said, like, that's going too far, we can't do that. But there are some things you can do. So I'm sure there's probably someone in the audience who's more deeply familiar with the details of all of these proposed reforms, but those are some of the noteworthy ones.
Thank you. Yes, please, audience members, we'd love to have your questions. And indeed, we have a question about inheritance. We have a question asking about whether your surveys ask specifically about what people believe should be the case with the division of inheritance across men and women. Have you asked a question about that, or are you aware of any?
Sorry, I was looking at the Q&A and I didn't listen. I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Sure, sure. One of our audience members has pointed out how polarizing the issue of inheritance is, and the gender division of inheritance. The audience member would like to know if you or anyone else has asked questions about attitudes towards gender and inheritance on surveys.
So yes, we have. I have asked this question. Other people have asked as well. I think, however, we haven't asked good questions about it. And I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. So the Air Barometer, going back a few years, asked two different versions of this question, and the differences in responses are very noteworthy. So they asked, should men and women have equal rights to their inheritance? Meaning, should their rights as they exist be enforced, essentially? And there's basically universal agreement with that, right? So people definitely want women to get what they are owed. The alternative version of the question was, should men and women have equal shares in inheritance? And opposition to that was roughly 80%, 80, 90%, depending on the country. And that is roughly in line with what we understand about how, most, kind of traditional interpretations of Sharia, the sort of main schools of law, will all say that, if you have, for example, a daughter and a son, and they're your main heirs, the son will get a portion that's twice as large as the daughter. And that's related to the expectations that he is financially responsible for his household, right? So that's the kind of standard understanding of it. There's a lot of nuances, but that's the basics. So, when you ask, should people have equal rights to it? Yes, everyone's in favor of that. Equal shares, not so much. What I think would be really interesting to look at is, vis-a-vis the new proposed reforms in the Mudawana, breaking it down for people into very specific proposals, right? So one of the ones in the new that's now being proposed is basically, can people pre-distribute inheritance before they die to circumvent some of these rules? And can that be considered like a legitimate distribution of their assets? And the religious scholars said, yeah, sure. Like if you want to like give your daughter a bunch of money before you die to make sure that she's not screwed over by these, the standard rules, like, yeah, be our guest. That's fine. So, we haven't polled people on something like that, right? To my knowledge, no one's polled on, some of these very kind of nuanced changes that could be done to better align with social realities and people's expectations without necessarily saying, oh, we're getting rid of Islamic law. Because I think when you ask people, should men and women have equal shares, they interpret that as, should we throw out Islamic law? And so there's going to be high opposition to that. So I don't think we know really what people's more nuanced opinions are on some of the ways that inheritance law could be reformed without, chucking out Sharia completely.
We also have a question about education. It seemed from your presentation that you thought that as men became more educated, they became more egalitarian in their views. Do you think that is the case across the region? Do you think there are some ways that, as our question asked, education can be weaponized or to push a deeply conservative agenda, or as some evidence has found on education in the Gulf countries, for instance, can lead to more conservative views? What is your view on education and how it may or may not promote men's egalitarian views or women's egalitarian views?
Yeah. So so yes, in Morocco, we see that on average, men with higher education hold more egalitarian attitudes. I don't think that means that education is like a silver bullet, for a few reasons. One is that the extent to which there's variation across educational levels differs across countries. So it seems like, it's not always working in the same way. We can see that. We also don't know if it's maybe that men coming from families that hold more egalitarian values are more likely to pursue higher education, right? So the direction of causality isn't clear. And finally, the content of education really matters. So one of the complaints actually of a lot of feminists in Morocco is that the education system instills misogynistic ideals and values in the way a lot of the curricula are formatted. And they are really pushing for curriculum reform to address this, to address the perpetuation of gender stereotypes and sort of outdated ideas. So I don't think it's a silver bullet. I do think it is an important space where attitude formation happens. But how it happens matters a lot, and it's clearly not happening in the same way everywhere.
Same. Yes, we have another question about social desirability bias as well. How we know that Moroccan men say they support gender equality and this is their true view as opposed to, an increasingly politically correct or sort of the right response, given that, even from the palace down, the message is that in Morocco, women need to be empowered and equal. Do you give
Yeah.
any credence to the idea of social desirability bias or politically correct answering?
Yeah, so to go back to, my discussion earlier, I'm not going to claim that there's no social desirability bias. I think, on the margins, probably there are certainly some people who are, answering differently based, because they think this is what they're supposed to say. But if that's really driving all of this, then I find it very puzzling that there are issues where people are willing to continue expressing such conservative ideas. I don't know why that pressure would exist more on some issues than others to such a great degree. Um, you know, I also find qualitatively, and this is not maybe not scientific, but I certainly found no shortage of people in Morocco willing to tell me that they think a lot of this women's rights stuff is you know inappropriate or wrong, right? Like the people who oppose it tend to be very vocal and not shy. And I think, to the extent that there is still this perception that conservatism is fairly dominant, they have a very enabling space to feel like this is these are legitimate views. I shouldn't be ashamed of this. We live in a very religious conservative country, and this is how everyone feels really. And so I'm not going to be shy about expressing that view. That's certainly my sense, is that people aren't shy about it when they want to be. And again, I don't really have everything to walk through all the different pieces of evidence, but from a lot of things I've looked at where we might think that switching the way we ask a question would change how people respond, or who's asking it, or the mode in which they're being asked, right? Whether it's in person or over the phone or in an online setting. There's some evidence that there are minor effects, so people might be modestly adjusting, but I don't think they're significant enough to account for this completely. Um, there was one other thing I was going to say there, but I've lost it, so I'll let us move on.
Yeah, sure. It's also interesting to think about the role of social media and globalization and the extent to which norms, or if people are having common experiences, they're engaging with people across the world. They're not just engaging with the people that are close to them in their neighborhood, but it's really a globalized experience. Do you see social media and new media as playing a role in the changing norms?
Yeah, I think I think it's an open question to what extent it can change norms versus to what extent it pushes people into silos where their existing ideas get reinforced. Right? We know the way social media algorithms work. You like something or you watch something, and then you tend to get funneled into seeing more and more of that content. I did on one of the surveys ask people, sort of what they thought were the most important influences on public opinion in Morocco. And I found roughly equal proportions thinking that social media was the most influential, about 40%. And people who thought that the government and state media were most influential, and that was also around 40%. And then other people cited other sources. Notably, religious scholars were not seen as being particularly influential. So what that suggests to me is that there's still a kind of very fragmented landscape in terms of what media people are consuming and what ideas they're being exposed to. I found that men with less education were most likely to say that the government and state media were the most influential, suggesting to me they are maybe the most attuned to kind of traditional media sources like television, radio even, versus more educated people and women who tended to say that social media was more influential. And they also tended to say that social media was a source of progressive values more than a source of conservative values. So that does suggest to me there is some kind of siloing of where people are getting influenced, but it also suggests that the state and the sort of traditional media can play a potentially very large role in communicating this new Mudawana reform, for example. Why is it happening? What is its content? To what extent is it in alignment with what Moroccans value and believe? And that could be potentially very influential. So I think it's not a story that, all that matters now is social media and what people are seeing on their phones. I think traditional media is also still very important. It's less clear to me, though, that social media is going to be a source of change versus just kind of reinforcing things that people already believe.
Interesting. I want to encourage the audience to continue to ask questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll make sure that they get asked and answered. I wanted to ask you a little bit about urban-rural divides as well. To what extent do you see changing gender norms or attitudes in rural areas as well as urban areas in Morocco or in other countries in the region or beyond?
Yeah, so if you look, generally in a lot of these surveys, if you break it down by urban versus rural respondents, urban respondents tend to hold slightly more egalitarian attitudes on average, but not nearly as much of a gap between urban and rural areas as popular narratives would suggest, right? Like one other thing that came up a lot talking to people in Morocco is they say, oh, it's these rural areas, they're so backwards, right? Especially people living in the big cities, there's this perception that they're very different from people in the rural areas. And the survey data just don't really bear that out, actually. And I think it's because maybe there's more conservative people in urban areas than people realize. But also there's this kind of stereotype about rural Moroccans that may also be a bit outdated. The gap is there. It's just not as big as I think people tend to believe. What I do find, though, is that, these perceptions of conservative views are overestimates even relative to the more conservative attitudes that do exist in rural areas. So it's kind of like, it's almost like people are anchoring on this stereotype they have about rural Moroccans. And even relative to that, they're thinking that things are more conservative than they are. So I think it's really interesting looking at the urban-rural divide because it undermines, stereotypes that people have in a few different ways.
It's interesting in the introduction of your book that you talked about China as a case, and in your presentation, you showed all the different countries whose sort of broad evidence that people are underestimating men's support for gender equality. So that suggests to me that there's something going on that's not region specific. This is not about the Middle East and North Africa. But how would you explain why, cross-nationally, people tend to assume that males are more patriarchal than they may actually be?
Yeah. So it's a little bit tricky because I think what one kind of has to do is try to explain the absence of something, right? So the real question is, as attitudes have become more egalitarian, why haven't people's perceptions kept up, right? Like, why are perceptions so stuck? And, I can show that a lot of the variation in this gap between attitudes and perceptions of them is really just down to, the extent to which there's attitudes are kind of very egalitarian, right? And perceptions are relatively more constant, right? There's less there's less variation across countries in perceptions than there is in actual attitudes. So my argument is trying to get at, like, what are the social forces that contribute to perceptions of men being so stuck? And that's where I think that the way women's rights have happened, the way that conservative opposition gets a lot of attention, can help us understand why there hasn't been a process of updating. And this sort of individual level spiral of silence, right? So I'm kind of trying to focus on explanations of why is it stuck everywhere? And do we think that those forces might be exerting themselves in particular in some cases more than others? But I do think they're kind of universal. And in contrast, people do seem to update their beliefs about what women support, right? So I didn't get into it in the talk, for sake of brevity, but we do actually see that people think that people's estimates of what women believe are much closer to the truth. And in some cases, people actually overestimate women's support, right? So particularly on questions of like affirmative action, so things like gender quotas, people sometimes think that women support that more than they actually do, right? So there's this distinct way that people think about men and women, and it's kind of like, women's rights have advanced and it's been very contentious, and it leads people to think that there's this huge void between men and women that's not, that there is a gap, but it's not nearly as big as people seem to think it is. So that's why my argument tries to kind of focus on like, what are the forces that lead to people not realizing that men are changing too?
It's interesting because, as you know, there are quite a few papers now, recent papers that that seem to suggest that there is, whereas the Middle East and North Africa used to be seen as the most patriarchal region and, perceived as being, unchanging. There's a lot of evidence from recent studies that suggest that social attitudes are really changing rapidly. Um, Turning to the United States or other Western countries, do you think that that people tend to underestimate men's support for gender equality here in the US? I don't know if you have looked at that, maybe you haven't, but if there's anything you would like to add.
So yes, in the cross-national data, they find that support is underestimated in the US on at least on women's work, but that people actually overestimate support for affirmative action for women, at least among women. More broadly, I think what will be interesting to see in the US is in light of, for example, media coverage of, the gender split in the vote for Trump versus Harris, narratives, media coverage of Gen Z men being, kind of fairly conservative or getting wrapped up in like online influencers who are pushing more misogynistic ideas. It's going to be interesting to me to see to what extent those trends exert influence on what people perceive about men, maybe beyond what's warranted, right? It seems like so one of the papers that I really like that I'm building on in my work that came out a few years ago, looked at sort of perceptions on a huge range of issues in the US and found that, for example, on some issues, Americans overestimate conservative beliefs, and on some issues, they overestimate liberal beliefs, but that their misperceptions tend to be based on a kind of broad narrative of progress, right? So Americans tend to believe that we're on a sort of march toward equality, on a march toward justice, right? And that this informs their misperceptions of norms today, sometimes in an overly liberal direction. And I think it will be interesting to see if the current political environment reverses that trend a little bit, right? If people no longer think that about the United States, and if that influences how what they estimate other people to believe in a way that might actually make the US start to look more like Morocco, where people have this kind of deep pessimism. Yeah, so I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, and maybe run those kind of surveys again in a few years and look at how that evolves.
Interesting. We have an audience question about maybe men define equality in a way that's different from women. I'm thinking as well about some of the support for democracy literature, where we use this term democracy, but it might mean different things to different people. Do you think that men and women might define equality differently, and how do you word questions in a way that helps you, better assess that?
Yeah. So I think this is a really difficult challenge. But one of the things that it reminds me of, that I'm glad to have a chance to talk about, is that I do think that there's nuances in how people conceive of gender equality, not only men but also women. So one of the things that a bunch of people have found now, including you, Lindsay, in your own work, is that a lot of support for women's rights in the Middle East seems to be driven by agreement with what we call benevolent sexism. Right. So this idea that that men and women are fundamentally different, but that there's some positive qualities that are sort of unique to women, or that women are sort of uniquely in need of protection is another form that it can take. But so one way this manifests itself is, for example, in people thinking that women are more moral, or less corrupt than men, that they're more likely to be honest, And there's actually, I find pretty high agreement with those ideas in Morocco, both actually more so among women than among men, but among both genders. And so, thinking back to this kind of discrepancy between people agreeing that men make better political leaders, but also wanting more women in politics and supporting gender quotas, right? How can we reconcile those things? And I think thinking about benevolent sexism can really help us there, because I think one can easily reconcile those if one thinks that we need more women in politics because they're more honest. They're going to help clean up corruption. They're going to do great service delivery for their constituents. But that doesn't mean I really want a woman in charge of the whole thing, right? Because she's not going to be like the tough guy. She's not going to do security as well as a man would, right? So one can continue to hold kind of, not necessarily negatively sexist views, but kind of positively sexist views about women in a way that supports their participation in public life without it meaning that one believes in like equality in the sense that I think a lot of feminists would like them to believe in it.
I really appreciate your nuanced understanding of this. And, again, to go to the support for democracy literature, there's these findings that suggest that people are in the abstract, supportive of democracy in the Arab world, but they might have insecurities or fears. They may not want democracy to be implemented in their country or their community for practical reasons. And I wonder, have you or others looked at the idea or the theory that perhaps people like gender equality in the abstract, but when it comes to the rights of their own family members, especially in the private sphere when we're talking about things like divorce, mobility, that maybe for them they don't want it. Do you think there's any evidence for this?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think support in the abstract is easy. And to go back to some of those findings I showed relating to sort of contributions in the household, I don't necessarily think men are lying about that. But I think some of them are expressing an abstract ideal that doesn't necessarily reflect how they or their families live their lives. And I think particularly when it comes to relations in the domestic sphere, sort of learned behaviors, and observing social norms in practice around you, probably influences behavior as much or more as some kind of abstract ideal. And I think observing those behaviors also contributes to these perceptions that the ideals are more conservative than they are, right? This mismatch between what people believe in the abstract and how they behave in reality, I think contributes to this ongoing misperception. So for example, and one really clear example of this that I have in one of the surveys is, so yes, people support women's right to work. They believe that men should be contributing in the household. But among a list of things that they would prioritize in terms of setting up their own ideal family structure, the most important to both men and women was that the husband of the family should have a job outside the home. They actually didn't care that much one way or the other whether women worked. It's kind of like, yeah, it's a nice to have if it brings in some extra money. But like, it's critically important that the man have a job, not just for financial stability, but I would argue also because it's integral to ideas about masculinity, and what it means to be a man and to be a provider. And so there is some inherent tension between placing such priority on male employment and also valuing equal male contributions within the household, right? And so I think that's a clear example where maybe some abstract ideals, if you ask that question on its own, don't necessarily reflect how people prioritize things in their actual lives.
That's very interesting. And there's also a political economic context, of high unemployment, in the wealthier countries, a high degree of migrant labor and things like that come into play. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we close out the questions?
No, thank you so much for all of your wonderful questions. This was, you really gave me a chance to elaborate on a lot of things that I think are really important.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to echo that, thank you so much, Dr. Barnett, Dr. Benstead, for that really kind of wonderful, thought-provoking kind of discussion about the implications of these gaps between attitudes and social sort of perceptions, which, gave us such an interesting insight into what's going on in contemporary Morocco, but also in what's going on in the US as well. Thanks also to our audience for joining us today, and for your wonderful questions. This is our last Crown seminar of the spring, but in April, we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary. And on April 23rd and 24th, we're hosting a two-day symposium that will bring leading Crown scholars, both past and present, together to answer two pivotal questions about the region. What are the biggest challenges that are facing the Middle East, and what are the opportunities for optimism? So across the region, we'll be focusing on four panels covering Iran, Egypt and North Africa, Iraq, the Levant, Turkey and the Arabian Peninsula. And so please be on the lookout for more information about our schedule. We will be streaming those panels over those 2 days. Thank you again, everyone, so much for being with us. Thank you again to our wonderful speaker and discussant, Dr. Barnett, Dr. Benson. Thank you. Bye-bye.